In the winter of 1888, a woman was carried through the iron gates of a state asylum in the hills of northern New England, bound at the wrists, silent, and already famous. For 11 years she had been the woman the local churches called when a case went past prayer. They called her an exorcist, though the diocese never used that word out loud. And now she was here, admitted as a patient, listed in the ledger under a single line that the clerk seems to have written twice and then crossed out once. Within her first month on the incurable ward, Sister Perpetua began to write on the walls, not scratches, not the ravings you would expect. The same passage, in a careful hand, repeated on every wall of every room she was allowed to enter. When the orderlies painted over it, she wrote it again by morning. And when they finally moved her to a bare stone cell with nothing to write with, the words appeared anyway, in the cells on either side of her, in the hands of two women who had never spoken to her and could not read. What she wrote was not a prayer, it was a history of a world that, according to every book we are handed in school, never existed at all. Before we go any deeper, do one small thing for me. Down in the comments, write the first year you think this story actually begins. A lot of you will put 1888, because that is the date on the ledger. Hold on to that year. By the end of this, you may want to come back and change it to something far older, and I want to see who called it early. Leave your answer now, then stay with me. To understand why a nun ended up on an incurable ward, you have to understand the town that sent her there. And the town of Halloway is a strange place to begin. It sits in the northern reach of what the older maps call Verrin County, in a fold of low hills that the railroad reached late and abandoned early. If you walk its main street today, and a few people still do, you notice something before you can put a name to it. The oldest buildings on that street sit too low in the ground. Their ground floor windows begin at the level of your knees. The stone lintels of doorways that were plainly meant to be grand now force a tall man to bow his head. The guides who run the historical society will tell you the town was raised over the decades, that the roads were built up with fill, that this is nothing unusual. And in most places it would be nothing unusual. But in Halloway the explanation never quite closes, because the fill runs deeper than any road crew was ever paid to lay, and because the same sunken windows and swallowed doorways repeat in towns for 100 miles in every direction. It is as if a single slow tide had moved through the whole region at once and left a mark on everything it reached. Wherever you find that mark, it sits at about the height of a grown person's chest. Remember that height. Sister Perpetua wrote about it more than anything else. Now, the record on Sister Perpetua herself is thin, and I want to be honest with you about that from the start. What we have are fragments, a church register, a handful of letters, the admission ledger of the Aldermore State Asylum, a single newspaper account that ran once and was never reprinted, and a set of photographs that should not have survived and very nearly did not. From those fragments, a shape emerges, and it is the shape of this whole story, so we are going to build it piece by piece and let you decide at the end what you think it means. Her secular name was Maren Coldwell. She was born, as near as anyone can tell, in the 1840s, in one of the river towns downstream from Halloway, and she took her vows young, before she was 20. For most of her life she was unremarkable in the way the church prefers its women to be. She taught, she nursed, she kept to the rule of her order, and then, sometime in the 1870s, she began to be sent for, not by the bishop, by ordinary people, farmers, widows, a mill foreman, people who had a problem in their house that the parish priest could not or would not name, and who had heard, in the way these things travel, that there was a sister 2 valleys over who could sit in a troubled room and make it quiet again. The church has a careful relationship with that kind of reputation. Officially, the diocese never granted Maren Coldwell any authority to perform the rite of exorcism. That authority is guarded jealously, and it was not given to nuns. Unofficially, for the better part of 11 years, she did the work anyway, and the priests who should have stopped her instead quietly sent her the cases they did not want their own names attached to. The people of Verrin County did not call her a nun who prayed with the disturbed. They called her the exorcist, and by the time she was carried through the gates of Aldermore, that word had followed her like a second shadow. Here is the detail that the single newspaper account fixes on, and it is the detail that made me start pulling on this thread in the first place. In the years before her own admission, Sister Perpetua was called to the Aldermore Asylum itself, not as a patient. As a kind of consultant. The asylum sat only a few miles above Halloway, on a rise that caught the wind, and it had among its incurable cases a scattering of women whose affliction did not look like ordinary madness to the house physician. These women did not rave at nothing. They wrote. They spoke of a world before this one, of water in the streets, of being carried as children out of a place taller and older than anything on the map, and they all described the same buried line at the height of the chest. The young physician who ran the ward, a man named Dr. Wren, was out of his depth and knew it, and he did something his superiors would later hold against him. He wrote to the parish and asked for the sister who was said to quiet troubled rooms. Sister Perpetua came. She spent, by the register, the better part of a season on that ward, and then she went home and refused every case she was offered afterward. For nearly 2 years she took no work at all. She was, by every account, a woman waiting for something. When it came fast. In the autumn of 1887 her order received a letter that no longer exists, but that 2 later writers describe as a confession. And in the winter of 1888 the same order that had spent a decade quietly using her signed the papers that committed her to the very ward she had been called to heal. She arrived bound at the wrists, which was standard, and silent, which was not. Most patients arrive frightened or furious. She arrived like a woman coming home to a house she already knew. The matron who received her, a hard and reliable woman named Hale, wrote in her own log a single line that has always stayed with me. She wrote that the new patient walked the corridor of the incurable ward without being led, turned into the correct room without being told, and stood at the far wall with her hand flat against the plaster as though she were listening to it. And within the month she began to write. The orderlies expected filth or scripture. What they got instead was one short passage, laid down in a steady, schooled hand, and repeated on every wall she could reach. The passage read, "Count the doors, not the years. The doors remember." That was the whole of it. "Count the doors, not the years. The doors remember." She wrote it above the beds and beneath the windows and around the frame of the single locked door, and when they scrubbed it away, she wrote it again by the following morning, and no one could say when, because no one ever caught her doing it. There is one more thing you need to hold in your mind before we go on, and it concerns those doors. In Halloway, and in the older wing of the asylum above it, the doorways do not match the buildings around them. They are too tall and too wide for the rooms they open into, and they are cut from a stone that no quarry in the county ever worked. The Historical Society calls this salvaged material, reused from some earlier structure, and maybe it is. But the earlier structure is never named, and no record of it survives, and the doors themselves carry marks along their frames that no one has ever satisfactorily explained. Faint grooves, regular, running at intervals up both sides, as though the frames had once held something now removed. Sister Perpetua would later cover pages with those grooves, copying them exactly, and beneath them she wrote a single word again and again. She wrote the word measure. Dr. Wren, who by now was an older and more cautious man than the one who had first written to her parish, kept a private notebook alongside the official ward log. In it he did something the asylum would never have permitted. He wrote down what she said out loud, word for word, on the rare occasions she spoke at all. And on one of those pages, dated in his own hand to the early spring of 1888, he recorded her answer when he asked her, gently, why she wrote the same sentence on every wall. She did not look at him. She kept her hand on the plaster, and she said that she was not writing it for the living. She said she was writing it for the ones who would come after the next flood, so that they would know to count the doors, because the years would already be gone by then, taken quietly, the way the last ones were taken. Then she asked him what year he thought it was, and when he told her, she smiled for the first and only time anyone recorded, and she said that the number was wrong by more than he could imagine, and that somewhere in a locked room in a city he trusted, there was a man whose entire task was to keep it wrong. That is the sentence she wrote on every wall, and that is the claim underneath it. Before we move on to what happened in the West Ward, stop for a second. What you just heard about the sentence she wrote on every wall is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original ward photographs from 1888, the buried doorways, the missing year. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. To make sense of what Sister Perpetua wrote, you have to understand what she had already seen, and here the fragments become both richer and stranger. The letters that survive from the families who called on her are not the letters of people describing a haunting in the way we imagine it. There are no chains rattling in them. There are no voices in the dark. What these families describe, over and over, is memory. Specifically, the sudden and unwanted return of memory in people who should have had none of it. Consider the case the newspaper account leads with, because it sets the pattern for all the rest. A farmer in the hills above Halloway had taken in, years earlier, a boy off one of the trains. You have to understand what that phrase meant in that county in those years. Between the 1850s and the end of the century, tens of thousands of children were moved across the country by rail, gathered up out of the eastern cities, and sent inland to be taken in by farming families. History gives us a clean and tidy reason for this. The cities were overcrowded, the children were orphans, and kindly institutions arranged new homes for them in the healthy countryside. That is the version in the school books, and I am not here to tell you it is entirely false. But Sister Perpetua's families tell a version underneath it, and it does not sit easily beside the tidy one. The farmer's boy had arrived, like all of them, with no history. No parents anyone could name. No town of origin that checked out. A first name, sometimes, and often not even that. The institutions that placed these children kept records that were thin to the point of being decorative, and when families later tried to trace where a particular child had truly come from, they ran into walls. Now, the boy had grown into a quiet and ordinary young man. And then, in his 20th year, he began to remember. Not his own childhood. Something older, he described, to his adoptive father, a city with streets like canals and buildings that went up further than the eye wanted to follow. He described being carried through water at night by adults whose faces he could not hold. He described arriving, with a great many other children, in a place that smelled of coal and river, and being sorted, and being told, gently and firmly and constantly, that he had always lived there, that there had been no water, that the tall city was a dream, and he described believing it for years until it began to come back. This is what the families brought to Sister Perpetua, not devils, rememberers. And here is the part that the Church could not forgive. She did not treat the memory as an illness. She sat with these young men and women, and she helped them hold the memory steady instead of letting it be scrubbed away again, and in more than one case the person came out of it calm and certain and entirely unwilling to go back to pretending. A troubled soul made quiet is a miracle. A troubled soul made quiet and heretical is a problem. The parish priests who had used her began to fear her, because the quiet she produced was not the quiet of a mind restored to the accepted world. It was the quiet of a mind that had left it. The confession letter of 1887, the one that no longer exists but that 2 later writers describe, is said to have contained her own account of what she had come to believe after 11 years of this work. According to those writers, she did not confess to fraud, or to pride, or to any of the ordinary sins her order might have hoped for. She confessed that she had come to believe the rememberers. She confessed that she thought there had been another world, and that it had ended in living memory within a lifetime or 2 of her own, and that the ending had been not only survived but managed, cleaned up, renovated. She confessed that she believed the great sorting of the children, the trains, the thin records, the tidy story about crowded cities, was the clean-up itself, carried out on the youngest survivors because the young forget most easily and can be told most convincingly what their own past had been. And she confessed one thing more. She wrote that she had begun to remember it herself. That is why they committed her, not because she raved, because she was lucid and specific, and because a lucid and specific woman saying these things in a county already full of low windows and buried doors was more dangerous than any mad woman could ever be. They did not send her to Aldermore to be cured. As a working hypothesis, and I want to be careful to call it that, they sent her to Aldermore because it was the one place where anything she said would be automatically classified as the symptom of a disease. On that ward, the truth and a delusion look exactly alike. That was the point. There is a second case worth sitting with, because it adds the piece the first one lacks. In a mill town on the far edge of the county, a young woman who had also come off the trains began, in her 20s, to write. She had been taught her letters late and badly, and yet what she produced was fluent, and it was always the same in structure. She would draw a tall doorway. Beside it she would draw a smaller doorway, the kind we build now, and between them she would write a number, and then cross it out. Always a number, always crossed out, as though the number were the forbidden thing and the doorways were merely the evidence. Her family, frightened, called the sister. And Sister Perpetua, according to the one letter that survives from that household, did not calm the young woman by telling her the doorways were a fancy. She calmed her by telling her the number was real, and that the crossing out was the wound, and that the young woman had been made to cross it out long ago and had never stopped bleeding from it since. Think about what that means as a pattern. Different children, taken in by different families, in different towns, with no way to have met, all returning in their 20s to the same handful of images. Water at night, a taller world, a sorting, a number that must not be spoken, and doors. Always the doors, and always the sense that the doors were the last honest measure of a world that had otherwise been quietly resized around them. A hoaxer could produce one such case. A disease could perhaps produce a scatter of them. But a disease does not hand every sufferer the same specific and buildable claim about architecture, and it does not aim that claim, as if on purpose, at the exact features that make the old towns of that county so quietly wrong to stand in. Sister Perpetua saw the pattern before anyone had a name for it, and when she finally stopped taking cases and sat alone for 2 years, I think she was doing the only thing left to a person in her position. She was waiting to become a case herself, so that she could carry the pattern into the one building where it was all gathered in one place, and write it on the walls where the next generation of rememberers would be brought, and where, sooner or later, someone from the outside might come looking. Someone, perhaps, a great deal later than she could have imagined. Which brings us to the building itself, and to the ground it was so strangely built upon. The Aldermore State Asylum was, on paper, an ordinary institution of its era, and its paper is a large part of the mystery. The official history says it was constructed in the 1850s, a single grand building in the style favoured for such places, set on a windy rise above Halloway to give the inmates clean air and a long view. It says the work took a few years and a modest budget. And then it says that the asylum grew wing by wing as the county's need for it grew, until it was the largest structure for many miles. Stand in front of the oldest part of it, though, or in front of the photographs of it that survive, and the paper starts to feel like a costume. The central building is not the work of a modest county budget. It is enormous, and it is precise, and it is faced in cut stone of a quality that the region was not producing and could not easily import over the roads that then existed. The proportions are wrong for the date in a way that is hard to describe until you have seen it, and then impossible to unsee. The windows of the lowest floor sit strangely close to the earth, exactly as they do down in the town, and along one side the ground rises against the wall until an entire row of them is half buried, their lower panes pressed against packed soil, as though the building had been set down and the land had risen around it, or as though it had been standing a very long time before anyone thought to date it. This is the observation at the heart of what people now call the buried world, and I want to lay it out plainly and without decoration, because it is the sturdiest strange thing in this whole account. All across that county, and far beyond it, there are grand buildings whose ground floors are sunk below the present level of the earth. Churches you enter by walking down, civic halls whose original front steps lead below grade, warehouses with windows at boot height. The accepted explanation is that ground levels rise naturally over time, that cities raise their streets, that this is the ordinary sediment of history, and in any single case, that explanation holds. The trouble is the sheer number of cases, and the way the buried line keeps arriving at the same height, and the way that height matches the line that Sister Perpetua's rememberers kept describing. The height of a grown person's chest. The height, if you believe the writing on the walls, that a slow flood of mud and water reached before it stopped, on a night that was afterward removed from the count. I am not asking you to accept that. I am asking you to notice that a woman locked in an asylum in 1888 was writing, in careful detail, about a specific flood line, and that when you go and look, the flood line is there, in the stone, at the height she named, in the very town that committed her. Whatever the true cause, the correspondence is real. She did not invent the buried doors, she was surrounded by them. The asylum had one more feature that matters to this story, and it is the feature that the young Dr. Wren had written to her about in the first place. Its incurable ward, the West Ward, was housed in the oldest and lowest part of the building, the part whose windows were most deeply buried, the part built from that too fine stone with the too tall doors. And it was on that ward, and almost only on that ward, that the strange cases gathered, the rememberers, the wall writers, the women who spoke of the taller world. It was as if the affliction were not in the patients at all, but in the ground, seeping up through the buried floor, and as if being confined against that particular wall, night after night, loosened something that ordinary life kept sealed. Dr. Wren seems to have half believed this himself, in the way a frightened, rational man half believes the thing he is standing in the middle of. His private notebook, the one that ran alongside the official log, contains a line I keep returning to. He wrote that the West Ward did not make women mad. He wrote that it made them remember, and that this was worse, because madness could be treated and memory could only be silenced. He did not write down who had taught him the difference. But we can guess. The woman who taught him was, by then, sleeping against that wall every night with her hand flat on the plaster, and covering it morning after morning with the same instruction. Count the doors, not the years. The doors, remember. Before we follow her into the longer account, it is worth pausing on the stone and the doors themselves, because they are the physical claim that the whole story rests on, and unlike letters and ledgers, they can in principle still be touched. The doors of the West Ward were, as I said, cut too tall and too wide, from a pale, close-grained stone unlike the rough grey the county quarried. Along both inner faces of each frame ran the faint regular grooves that Sister Perpetua copied so obsessively, and that she labelled over and over with the word measure. No architect of the 1850s would have had reason to cut such grooves. They serve no structural purpose. They align with nothing in the building as it now stands. But if you accept, only as a working hypothesis, that these doors were salvaged from something older and larger and then set into a newer wall, the grooves begin to look less like decoration and more like fittings. Slots where something had been mounted and later stripped out, and the something, if we follow the writing on the walls, was the thing she seems to have feared losing most, a means of measuring, a standard against which the true size of the old world and the true length of the missing year could still be checked. Dr. Wren recorded, in the same careful private hand, that patients confined near those doors reported a sensation he did not know how to categorize. They said the doorway felt taller than the wall it sat in, not looked taller, felt taller, as though it opened onto a room with a higher ceiling than the one you could see, and as though if you stepped through quickly enough you might arrive somewhere with more air above your head. He noted that this was of course impossible, that the room beyond was the same low room, that he had measured it himself, and then he noted, in a smaller and more honest line beneath, that he had measured it 3 times at 3 different hours, and that on the last occasion the figures had not agreed, and that he had chosen not to measure it a 4th time. That is the sentence of a man beginning to be afraid of his own instruments. It is also, if you take Sister Perpetua seriously, exactly the fear she had come there to provoke. The longer account began, as best Dr. Wren could reconstruct it afterward, on a night of hard rain in the early spring. The matron Hale found the first of it at dawn, and what unsettled her was not that it was there, but that there was so much of it. Sister Perpetua had covered the entire east wall of her room, floor to the limit of her reach, in a single unbroken passage written in that same schooled hand, without a wasted stroke and without a single correction. A woman writing in the dark, without light, without being heard, without pausing, and getting every line right the first time. Hale, who was not a fanciful woman, wrote that it looked less like something composed than something copied, as though the sister were transcribing from a text only she could see. The passage itself has come down to us in pieces, because the full wall was never photographed intact, and what we have is stitched from Wren's notebook, from Hale's log, and from the single newspaper account. But the pieces agree on its shape, and its shape is a chronicle. It told of a world that stood before this one. Not a mythic world, not a paradise, but a built world, with cities and roads and a great many people, taller in its architecture than ours and finer in its stonework, lit and warmed by means the account does not fully name but circles around, describing towers that gave out heat and light without fire and drew it, somehow, from the air itself. It told of that world ending, not in a single day of fire, but over a season of rising water and moving earth, a flood not only of water but of mud, that came up through the low places and stood at the height of the chest and did not recede for a long time, and that when it finally withdrew had buried the ground floors of everything and killed most of those who had not climbed. And then it told the part that no school book contains. It told that the ending had been survived by enough people to matter, and that among the survivors were those who moved quickly, in the confusion, to take control of what came next, not to rebuild the old world, to replace it with a story. The account describes, in Sister Perpetua's steady hand, a deliberate work of renovation carried out in the years after the water. The taller buildings that had survived were credited to the new order, said to have been built by them in a burst of glorious progress, displayed at great fairs, and then tellingly torn down. The heat and light towers were dismantled, and their function denied and forgotten. The calendar was adjusted, a stretch of years quietly folded away or renumbered, so that the flood would sit not within living memory, but safely back in a past too distant to check. And the children, the ones young enough to be reshaped, were gathered from the flooded cities and moved inland by the trainload, resettled among families who were told a clean story and taught, patiently and completely, that the world had always been as it now was. This is a great deal to find written on the wall of an asylum, and I understand entirely if part of you is pulling back from it. Part of me pulls back from it too. But hold that reaction beside a single fact, and let the two sit together. The woman who wrote this had, by every account, no education in history beyond the ordinary, no access to books on any of these subjects, and no way of knowing that a century later people standing on ordinary streets would notice the same buried doors and ask the same forbidden questions she was writing on the plaster in the dark. She was not summarizing a theory that existed. As far as the record shows, she was originating it, alone, in a locked room in 1888, and she was not the only one writing it. That is the part that broke Dr. Wren. Within days of the long passage appearing on Sister Perpetua's wall, the woman in the next room began to write. Her name in the ledger was given only as Tace, a word that is not really a name, and she was recorded as mute and as unable to read or write. She had been on the ward for years and had never made a mark. Now she covered her own wall in the same hand. Not a similar the same hand. The same schooled, unhurried letters, the same phrasings, the same chronicle of the taller world and the standing mud and the sorted children. A woman who could not write, writing fluently, in the penmanship of the woman next door, a text the two of them could not have discussed because one of them had never spoken in her life. Hale, to her great credit, did not simply scrub it away. She fetched Wren, and Wren stood in the corridor between the two rooms and read the two walls, and found them, line for line, the same. And then, from the room on the far side of Tace, they heard the third woman begin. The third woman was the old washerwoman the ledger called Belle, and she was, unlike Tace, perfectly capable of speech, which somehow made it worse. She had been admitted for a plain and pitiable reason, grief that had turned to confusion after the loss of her family, and for years she had spoken of nothing but them. Now she stood at her wall with a nub of charcoal she should not have had, and she wrote the chronicle too, and while she wrote she talked, steadily and calmly, and what she said was not her own life. She described the canals of the taller city as though she had walked them. She described the night of the water as though she had waded through it with a child on her hip. She used names, place names, that appear nowhere on any map of the county or the country, and she used them without hesitation, the way you would name your own street. Wren wrote them all down. Later, when the records were gathered up and taken away, those pages of names were among the first to vanish, and I think that is worth noticing. Of everything on that ward, the names were what someone wanted gone most. By the end of that week, the West Ward held not one wall writer, but a growing number of them, and the writing was spreading against every rule of how such things should work. It did not pass between women who talked. It passed between women confined near the same buried doors. A patient moved into a room on the west ward would be silent for a night or two, and then wake and begin to write the chronicle in the shared hand, whether or not she could previously write at all. A patient moved off the ward into the newer wings above ground would fall silent within days and remember nothing of what she had written. It behaved less like an idea and more like a property of the place. Something in the ground, in the buried stone, in the two tall doors with their stripped grooves, that the newer floors were sealed against and the old west ward was not. Dr. Wren's notebook, in these entries, stops sounding like a physician's log and starts sounding like a man taking down testimony he does not want to be the only witness to. He wrote that he had begun to believe the ward was not producing a delusion but conducting one, the way a wire conducts a current, and that the source of the current was not any single patient. He wrote that he had gone down alone one night to the oldest door on the ward and laid his own hand against the pale stone, as he had seen Sister Perpetua do 100 times, and that he had taken his hand away almost at once and had not slept. He did not write what he felt through the stone. He only wrote that afterward he understood why she never stopped writing, and that he had begun, in the privacy of the notebook, to keep account of the doors himself. News of a ward where mute women wrote in a borrowed hand did not stay on the ward for long. It reached the superintendent, a Dr. Elias Marsh, who was everything the young Wren was not. Marsh was ambitious, orderly, and entirely certain of the world as it had been handed to him, and he regarded the West Ward the way a careful man regards a fire in his own house, as something to be put out quickly and quietly before it drew a crowd. He came down, he read the walls, and he did not stand there and grow afraid the way Wren had. He grew angry. To Marsh, the writing was a contagion of hysteria, a thing that spread by suggestion among weak and idle minds, and the cure for it was the cure for any contagion: isolation. Remove the source, seal it away, deny it any audience, and the rest would subside. He identified the source correctly. Whatever you believe about where the chronicle truly came from, it had entered that ward through Sister Perpetua, and it radiated outward from the room where she slept. So Marsh ordered her removed from the ward entirely and confined in a place the asylum kept for its most violent cases, though she had never once been violent. It was a cell in the deepest and oldest part of the foundation, below even the west ward, a bare stone room without a bed, without a window, without a single surface she could mark, and, crucially, without anything to mark it with. She was searched. Her hands were bound. She was given no charcoal, no pencil, no pin, nothing. The room was scrubbed to the bare stone before she entered it and inspected after. Marsh, by his own later report, considered the matter closed. He had, as he put it, removed the pen from the hand. What happened next is the reason this story survived at all, because it was too strange for even Marsh to fully bury. The writing continued, not in her cell, where she had nothing to write with and where, when they checked, the walls remained bare. It continued upstairs, on the west ward, in the rooms she had been removed from and could not possibly reach. The women there kept writing the chronicle in the shared hand, night after night, as though her removal had changed nothing at all. And worse, from Marsh's point of view, the writing appeared in new places it had never been. It appeared in the 2 cells adjoining Sister Perpetua's own, down in the foundation, in the deep dark where the most violent patients were kept. The women in those cells, the ones the ledger called Tace and Bell after they too were moved down to be near her, wrote the chronicle on their walls in charcoal they were never given, in a hand that was not their own and was unmistakably hers, while the woman whose hand it was sat between them with bound wrists and bare walls, having written nothing. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that ought to make you suspicious, and it made the more honest people at the asylum suspicious too. Wren's first assumption was the sane one. Someone was supplying the charcoal. Someone was doing the writing and blaming it on the confined women. He set out to catch them. He watched the corridor himself, through nights that his notebook records in shaky and exhausted detail, and he caught no one, and the writing appeared anyway, on walls he had watched, in a corridor he had not left. He checked the bound woman's hands for charcoal and found none. He checked the writing against her known hand and found them identical. He was a rational man doing the rational thing thoroughly, and the thoroughness is what destroyed his ability to keep believing the rational thing. He wrote, near the end of that stretch, that he no longer knew what was writing on the walls of his asylum, only that it was not being stopped by locking up the woman he had blamed, and that this frightened him more than the writing ever had. Marsh's response to all of this was not to wonder, it was to escalate. If isolation had not silenced the source, then the source would be silenced by other means, and here the account grows dark in a way I want to handle carefully rather than sensationally. The treatments used on the incurable and the difficult in asylums of that era were, by our standards, brutal, and Marsh had the full menu of them available. Cold immersion, restraint for days at a stretch, the various devices and regimens that were then defended as medicine and that we now recognize as something closer to torture. What the records suggest, in their careful institutional language, is that Sister Perpetua was subjected to a course of these treatments intended to break the pattern by breaking her. And what the records also suggest, in their gaps and their sudden silences, is that it did not work, and that the failure was itself part of what made the asylum decide, in the end, that the whole affair had never happened. There is a detail from this stretch that I've gone back and forth on including, because it is the hardest to credit and also the hardest to explain away, and in the end, I think you should have it and judge it yourself. During the worst of the treatments, when Sister Perpetua was kept in cold restraint below ground and unable to lift her own hands, the wall writing on the west ward above her did not merely continue, it changed. For the first time it stopped being a chronicle of the past and began to be something addressed to the present. The women upstairs, in the shared hand, began to write what read like a countdown, not of numbers, for she had always refused numbers, but of conditions. They wrote of a second flood that would come as the first had come, up through the low places, on a night taken from the count, and they wrote that the doors would be the only measure left when it did, and they wrote, again and again, a single line that Wren recorded with a note that his own hand was unsteady as he did. When the water stands at the chest a second time, the ones who counted the doors will know the year, and the ones who trusted the calendar will drown in it. Marsh read that line, and Marsh, whatever else he was, understood a threat when he saw one, not a threat of violence. A threat of memory, spreading, arriving eventually at people who would go and check the doors and find them exactly as described. He gave the order to end the treatments, not out of mercy, but because they were not working and because every day they continued produced more of this writing, not less. And he began, instead, the quieter work that asylums of that era were very good at, the work of making a thing not have happened, which meant the records and the photographs and the young physician who had written too much of it down. But before we follow the erasure, we have to sit with what the chronicle actually claimed, in full, because everything the asylum did next only makes sense once you understand what they were so determined that no one outside those walls would ever read. So let us do the thing Dr. Marsh spent the rest of his career making sure no one could do. Let us read the walls. The first thing the chronicle insists on, before any flood or any conspiracy, is simply the scale of the world that came before. Sister Perpetua wrote about it the way a person writes about a home they have lost, with a kind of exact and aching specificity, and the details cluster around building and stone. She wrote that the old world built in forms we no longer build and can no longer fully explain, and among the forms she named was one that anyone who has looked into these questions will recognize at once. She described fortifications shaped like stars, low walls thrown out in perfect geometric points, angle answering angle, laid out with a precision that she said was not for war at all, whatever we now assume, but for something to do with the flow of what the towers gathered from the air. She wrote that we find these star shapes everywhere, in every country, built to the same impossible standard by peoples who supposedly never met and never shared a plan, and she asked, on the wall, why a scattered and primitive world would independently arrive at the identical intricate geometry, and why that geometry would always be described to us afterward as merely military, when the earliest and finest of them guard nothing and command no ground worth holding. I am aware that I am now describing something that exists on 10,000 maps. The star forts are real. You can visit them. The standard explanation for them is indeed military, a response to the canon, and that explanation is not absurd, but sit with the coincidence that a woman locked in an asylum in 1888, with no engineering education and no access to the atlases that would show the worldwide spread of these shapes, wrote about them with confidence, tied them to a lost technology, and posed the exact objection that people would be arguing about long after she was dead. She was not repeating a controversy. There was no controversy yet. She was, if the account is honest, remembering a purpose. The stonework was the second insistence. She wrote about walls fitted without mortar, of stones so large and so precisely joined that a blade will not pass between them, and she wrote that the New World could not do this and had never been able to, and that when the New World found such walls standing, it did one of two things. It either tore them down and built cruder work on the foundations and took the credit, or it left them standing and invented a story about ancient primitives with ropes and ramps and endless patience, a story that grew more elaborate the less it explained. She wrote that the tell was always the same. Wherever you find stonework the current world cannot reproduce, you will also find, close by, a confident explanation of how simple people long ago did it easily, and the confidence of the explanation is proportional to how little sense it makes. And then the towers. This is the part of the chronicle that strays furthest from anything we can touch, and so it is the part I hold most loosely, but I will give it to you as she gave it. She wrote that the tall old cities were lit and warmed and moved by a power drawn out of the air itself, gathered through the tallest of the towers and the finest of the metalwork, and distributed without wires and without fuel, freely, to everyone within reach of a tower. She wrote that this was not magic, and was not lost knowledge in the sense of a forgotten trick, but knowledge that had been taken, deliberately, dismantled and denied by the new order, because a world that warms itself for free cannot be governed the way a world that must buy its heat can be governed. She wrote that the ornate ironwork we still see on the oldest buildings, the finials and the crestings and the strange decorative spires that serve no purpose anyone can now name, were not decoration at all, but the stripped and blinded remains of the collecting apparatus, left in place because they were too numerous to remove and too mysterious to explain, and so simply reclassified as ornament. You are free to disbelieve all of it. I disbelieve some of it myself, on the days I am being sensible. But notice the structure of the claim, because the structure is the same every time, whether she is writing about forts or stones or towers. In each case, she names a real feature of the old world that genuinely puzzles people. In each case, the accepted explanation is one that grows more insistent the harder it is pressed. And in each case, her alternative is not a fantasy bolted on from outside, but a single simple idea that ties the puzzles together. That there was a taller, finer, freer world, that it ended, and that the ending was cleaned up. Once you hold that idea, the forts and the stones and the ironwork stop being separate mysteries and become one mystery, seen from different sides. That is either the mark of a delusion of unusual coherence, or it is the mark of a memory. And the asylum, tellingly, treated it as neither. It treated it as something to be destroyed. Before we go to the children, there is one thread from the chronicle that ties the old world directly to the doors of the asylum, and it is the thread she labelled with that single obsessive word, measure. She wrote that the old world kept, in its finest buildings and in the fittings of its grandest doors, a physical standard of measurement, a true and shared unit against which everything could be checked, and that this standard encoded not only length but the true count of the years. She wrote that the first act of the new order, before the fairs and the demolitions and the trains, was to strip these standards out and replace them with new units, close enough to feel familiar and different enough to make the old buildings read as strangely proportioned, as though the ancients had simply built to odd sizes. Change the measure, she wrote, and you change the size of the past. Make the old doors seem merely tall instead of exactly tall, and no one can use them to prove what they were built to fit. The grooves in the asylum doors, the ones she copied 1,000 times, were, in her account, the empty sockets where such a standard had once been mounted and later pulled out. That is why she cared about the doors more than anything else on those walls. Not because they were haunted, because they were the last uncorrupted ruler in a world that had quietly changed its own inch. Count the doors, not the years. The doors, remember. because the doors were the one thing too heavy and too numerous to fully recalibrate. Now hold that, and let us finally read what she wrote about the children. The children are the moral centre of the whole account, and they are also the part that is easiest to check against the ordinary record, which is what makes them so unsettling. Sister Perpetua wrote that after the water stood and withdrew, the survivors of the taller world were a broken and scattered population, and that the new order faced a simple problem. Adults remember. An adult who had walked the canals of the old cities and waded through the standing mud on the night that was later erased could be told a new story, but could not be made to truly believe it, not all the way down. The memory would sit in them like a stone, and it would pass, in fragments and in dread, to anyone they raised. You cannot renerate a world while its witnesses are still raising the next generation on the truth. But children are different, she wrote, and the younger the better. A child young enough can be told that the flood was a dream, that the tall city never existed, that the family they half remember was a fever, and if the telling is patient and total and comes from every direction at once, the child will not merely obey it. The child will believe it, and will grow into an adult who defends it, and will raise their own children inside the new story without ever knowing there was another. So the new order, according to the Chronicle, gathered the children of the flooded world, separated them from any adult who remembered, moved them far from the drowned cities where a stray canal or a buried door might jog something loose, and distributed them across the countryside among families primed to receive them and to tell them, always, that they had come from ordinary orphanhood in ordinary crowded towns. And here is where the wall meets the archive, because we have those trains. The historical record is entirely open about the fact that, across exactly the decades the Chronicle points to, enormous numbers of children were gathered in the eastern cities and moved inland by rail to be placed with rural families. The accepted account gives humane reasons, overcrowding, and poverty, and reform. And I want to be fair and say those reasons are real and documented, and that many of those children were genuinely helped. But the accepted account also has the features Sister Perpetua taught us to look for. The records of where the children truly came from are astonishingly thin to the point that many could never trace their own origins, no matter how hard they later tried. The numbers are vast, and the individual histories are vapour, and the story told to the children about their own past was, by design, a clean and total substitution, delivered by every adult around them with perfect consistency. Whatever the true reason for the trains, they are, structurally, exactly the instrument the Chronicle describes, a means of taking the youngest survivors of something and raising them inside a story that was not theirs. Sister Perpetua's rememberers, the farmer's boy and the Milltown girl, and all the others who had brought their returning memories to her over 11 years, had one thing in common that she stated plainly on the wall. They had all come off the trains, every one of them. The affliction she was famous for quieting was not scattered randomly through the population. It clustered precisely among the transported children, and it surfaced precisely in their 20s, at the age when the imposed story finally began to wear thin over the buried thing beneath it. She was not exorcising demons. She was, without a word for it, tending the survivors of a managed forgetting as their forgetting failed. Then there is the year, the stolen year, the missing count, the number that the Milltown girl kept writing and crossing out, the number that Sister Perpetua refused to write at all and would only gesture at. This is the strangest single claim in the Chronicle, and I give it to you last because it is the one I understand least. She wrote that the calendar itself had been altered in the Great Renovation, that a stretch of the count had been added or removed or renumbered, so that the flood would fall not within living memory but in a comfortably distant past, and that the true present year was not the year everyone believed. She would not write the false number, and she would not write the true one. She said only, to Dr. Wren, in the line he recorded with a shaking hand, that the number was wrong by more than he could imagine, and that somewhere in a locked room in a city he trusted there was a man whose whole task was to keep it wrong. She said the calendar was the softest of all the alterations and the most important, because a wrong measure of stone can be caught by a standing door, but a wrong measure of time leaves no door to check it against. You cannot walk up to a year and press your hand to it. And so the stolen year was the one lie that had no ruin, no buried window, no groove in a frame to give it away. It was, she wrote, the perfect crime, and the only trace it left was the faint wrongness that a transported child would feel in their 20s when the imposed past first failed to add up. That is the whole of the chronicle, or as much of it as survived the asylum's determination that none of it should. A taller world, ended by a flood of water and mud that stood at the chest and was struck from the count. A new order that renovated the ruin into progress, tore down what it could not explain, stripped the free towers and reclassified their remains as ornament, changed the measure of length and the measure of time, and raised the surviving children inside a story that was not theirs, moving them inland by the trainload so no buried door could ever remind them. And a single instruction, left on every wall a locked woman could reach, for whoever might one day stand among the buried doors and begin to feel the wrongness for themselves. Count the doors, not the years. The doors, remember. The asylum read all of this, and then the asylum set out to make sure that we never would. An institution has two ways of dealing with something it cannot allow to be true. It can destroy the thing, or it can destroy the credibility of anyone who saw it. Dr. Marsh, over the months that followed, used both, and he used them methodically, and the fact that we are able to reconstruct any of this is due entirely to the one man who saw it coming and worked quietly against it. The official ward log, the sanctioned record that would survive any inspection, was steadily and carefully edited. Where it had recorded the wall writing as a phenomenon, it was rewritten to record it as the isolated delusion of a single disturbed patient, with the spread to other women reframed as ordinary suggestibility among the weak-minded. The names the washerwoman Bell had spoken, the place names that appear on no map, were struck out entirely, and the pages that had held them were, in at least 2 cases, removed and replaced with clean sheets in a hand that is not Wren's. The longer chronicle, the account of the taller world and the flood and the trains, was reduced in the official log to a single dismissive phrase about religious mania and grandiose ideation. Anyone reading only the sanctioned record would come away with the tidy impression of a mad nun who thought she was a prophet, and would never suspect that 3 floors of women had written the same forbidden history in the same borrowed hand. Marsh understood, too, that a written record can be edited, but a photograph is harder to argue with, and the asylum had, unfortunately for him, taken photographs. It was not unusual for institutions of that era to photograph unusual cases, and someone, probably Wren, had photographed the walls. The images showed the west ward rooms with their plaster-covered floor to reaching height in the dense, unbroken chronicle, and they showed, crucially, more than one room, which meant they showed the spread. A single mad patient could be dismissed. Photographs of 4 separate rooms in 4 separate hands that were somehow one hand could not be so easily dismissed by anyone who looked carefully. Marsh ordered the photographs destroyed, and this is the hinge on which the whole survival of this story turns, because they were not all destroyed. Wren, before he handed over the plates he was known to have, made a second set, and he did not keep them at the asylum. He sent them away, to a person outside the institution whose name the surviving correspondence does not give, with a letter asking only that they be kept and not shown until a time when showing them might be safe. He did not think that time would be soon. He wrote that it might be very long indeed, and that he was content to be forgotten if the plates were not. As for Wren himself, it did not accuse him of anything dramatic. It simply, quietly, began to describe him as unwell. "Overwork," they said. Nervous exhaustion brought on by too much time on the difficult ward. A promising young man who had let the delusions of his patients infect his own judgment. It is a devastating weapon precisely because it is so gentle and so plausible, and because the harder the accused protests that he is perfectly sane and telling the truth, the more he confirms the diagnosis. Wren was eased out. His private notebook, the one that ran alongside the official log and recorded what Sister Perpetua actually said, was not entered into any archive and would have been lost entirely except that it, too, seems to have gone into the same hands that received the photographic plates, and to have waited there, in the dark, with them. I find Wren the most human figure in this whole account, and the most quietly heroic, and I want to say why. He was not a believer. He never once, in anything that survives, states that he thinks the chronicle is true. He was a rational man who had been handed something his rationality could not close, and instead of choosing a comfortable answer, he did the one thing that keeps a mystery alive across a century. He preserved the evidence and refused to interpret it. He wrote, in one of the last entries we have from him, that he did not know whether the women of the West Ward were remembering a real world or sharing a single magnificent madness, and that he had decided it was not his to decide, and that his only duty was to make sure the question could still be asked by someone with better tools than he had at some later date, when asking it might no longer cost a man his standing and his sanity. He kept the doors in his way. He counted them, and he passed the count forward, which leaves the woman at the centre of it. And here the record does the cruelest thing it does anywhere in this story. It simply stops. Sister Perpetua's name appears in the asylum's admission ledger, clear and dated, in the winter of 1888. It appears in the edited ward log through that spring and into the summer, in the diminishing dismissive phrases "marsh permitted." And then it is gone. There is no discharge recorded. There is no transfer to another institution. There is, most tellingly, no death recorded, no burial in the asylum's own ground where the unclaimed dead of that place were laid without ceremony, and where a woman with no family to object would ordinarily have gone. A patient admitted for life, who is neither discharged nor transferred nor buried, and who simply ceases to appear, is an anomaly that institutions almost never produce by accident, because the paperwork of death was one thing such places did with grim reliability. Someone chose to leave her exit blank, whether that means she died and was disposed of without record, or was moved to some deeper confinement whose ledger has not survived, or something the sensible part of me will not write down. The honest answer is that we do not know. The last certain thing we have of her is a photograph, on a plate that was smuggled out and hidden, showing a stone wall-covered floor to reaching height in a steady schooled hand, and, in the lower corner of the frame, a single small pale shape that Wren labelled on the plate's own margin as the subject's hand, flat against the plaster, listening. The asylum outlived everyone in this story, as institutions tend to, and for a long time it kept its secret perfectly, which is to say it kept it the way such secrets are usually kept. Not behind a lock, but behind boredom and disbelief and the sheer difficulty of caring about a mad nun in a county nobody visits. Dr. Marsh's method worked. He had reduced a ward-wide phenomenon to a single line about one disturbed patient, and a single line about one disturbed patient is the kind of thing that survives in an archive precisely because no one ever bothers to question it. He went on to a long and respectable career. He was, in the way of such men, remembered as a reformer, a modernizer, a physician who brought order to a troubled institution, and the trouble he brought order to was never described in any detail that would make a later reader curious. He won by making the truth uninteresting. It is the most effective erasure there is. The physical asylum met the fate that so many of these old low-windowed buildings met, and the timing of it is either a grim coincidence or the last chapter of the cover, depending on how much you are willing to suspect. Sometime in the early part of the next century, the oldest wing of the Aldermore Asylum burned. Fires in such buildings were common, and this one was recorded as accidental, and it may well have been, but the wing that burned was the West Ward, the old low part built of the two fine stone, the part whose buried windows and two tall doors held the whole physical case. The newer wings, the sanctioned and unremarkable ones, largely survived. And when the ruin of the West Ward was cleared, the pale, close-grained stone of those strange door-frames, the ones with the grooves Sister Perpetua had copied 1,000 times and labelled measure, was carted away and never accounted for. The one set of objects in this entire story that a person could, in principle, still walk up to and press a hand against and check against her claims was reduced to rubble and hauled off to no recorded destination, in a fire nobody was ever blamed for. "Count the doors," she had written, and in the end someone made very sure there were no doors left to count. Almost no doors. Because the plates and the notebook were already gone, out of the building and into the dark, years before the fire, in the hands of a person whose name we do not have. And this is the thread that runs, thin and unbroken, from that locked cell all the way to us. For decades the hidden material simply waited, passed presumably from one keeper to the next the way such uncomfortable inheritances are, a box of glass plates, and a physician's notebook that no one quite wanted and no one was willing to throw away. There is a long silence in the middle of this story, a stretch of many years where nothing happens and no one looks, and that silence is not a gap in the evidence, it is part of what the evidence shows. Sister Perpetua had said she was not writing for the living. She had said she was writing for the ones who would come after the next flood, in a language of buried doors, for a generation that would not be born for a long time. A story built to wait is supposed to have a long silence in the middle of it. The silence is the plan working. What broke the silence was the simplest and most modern thing imaginable. People began, in our own era, to look at the old buildings again, not scholars. Ordinary people, with cameras of their own, noticing the same knee-high windows and the same buried doors and the same two grand civic halls in two poor towns that Sister Perpetua had been surrounded by, and asking, out loud and in public, the exact question she had written on the plaster. Why is this building sunk into the ground? Why does the official story of who built it not add up? Why does the same buried line arrive at the same height in 1,000 places at once? They did not know her name. They had never heard of the West Ward. They were reconstructing her chronicle from the outside, from the stones and alone, a century and more after she wrote it in the dark, and arriving, feature by feature, at the same shape. And it was into that new noticing, that new willingness to distrust the tidy story, that the hidden plates and the notebook finally, quietly, resurfaced. I want to be careful and honest about that resurfacing, because it is the part a careful person should press on hardest. I cannot hand you a chain of custody for the plates that would satisfy a court. The name of the original keeper is not recorded. The path the material took across the intervening decades is not documented in the way we would want. What we have is the material itself, the glass plates showing the covered walls of more than one room, the physician's notebook in a hand consistent with the sanctioned log, the admission ledger with its doubled and crossed out line, and the single newspaper account that ran once and vanished. Each of these, on its own, could be doubted. A determined skeptic can construct an account in which a clever hoaxer assembled the lot. I have tried to construct that account myself, in good faith, on the sensible days, and I keep running into the same wall the honest people at the asylum ran into. The hoax would have had to originate the entire buried world idea, in complete and coherent form, a century before that idea existed as a public question, and then aim it, detail by detail, at features of the real landscape that no one would notice or care about until our own time. A hoax that predicts the shape of a controversy 100 years before the controversy exists is a strange kind of hoax. At some point, the effort required to fake the thing exceeds the effort required to simply have witnessed it. I am not telling you which side of that line to come down on. I am telling you that the line is real, and that standing on it is deeply uncomfortable, and that Sister Perpetua seems to have designed her whole testimony to leave a later reader standing exactly here, uncertain, with a hand against the plaster, listening. So let us do the last thing left to do. Let us go and see what is actually still there, in the ordinary world, that we can check for ourselves. What remains, in the end, is not the asylum and not the plates, but the landscape, and the landscape is the one witness that cannot be edited, burned, or eased into early retirement. Sister Perpetua's whole method, if you strip it to the bone, was to point away from herself and toward things a person could go and check with their own eyes and their own hands, and that method is why her testimony has outlived every effort to erase it. You do not have to believe the story of the West Ward to test its central claim. You only have to go outside. Start with the doors and the windows, because that is where she started. In almost any town old enough, you can find them. Buildings whose ground floor windows sit lower than they should, whose original entrances have become half basements, whose grandest civic structures are sunk into the earth by a course or two of stone, as though the ground had risen up their walls. The accepted explanation, that street levels rise over time, is true and available, and I have repeated it fairly throughout, and in any single case it is enough. What Sister Perpetua asks of you is not to reject that explanation, but to notice how often you have to reach for it, and to notice that the buried line, when you start measuring it, keeps arriving near the same height, and to sit with the small cold feeling that produces. That feeling, she would say, is not superstition. It is the transported child in you, feeling the imposed story wear thin over the buried thing beneath. Go to the star forts, if you can, or to their maps, which are freely available. Notice their spread across every continent, their shared and intricate geometry, the way the finest and earliest of them guard nothing and answer to no strategic need anyone can now reconstruct. Read the confident military explanation, and then read it a second time, and notice, the way she taught, that its confidence grows exactly where its evidence thins. Look at the ornate ironwork on the oldest surviving buildings, the finials and spires and crestings that everyone agrees are merely decorative, and ask why a poorer, cruder past lavished such intricate metalwork on pure ornament, while a richer present does not bother, and hold her alternative in your mind, not as a belief, but as a question you are now unable to unask. And go, above all, to the record of the trains, because that is the claim that touches real and grieving human beings, and the one we can most nearly verify. The transportation of vast numbers of children inland by rail, across exactly the decades she named, is not a fringe theory. It is documented, open, and taught. What is also documented, if you look, is the thinness of the origin records, the multitude of children who could never trace where they truly came from, the completeness with which each was given a new and consistent story of an ordinary orphaned past. I am not asking you to conclude that these children were survivors of a drowned world. I am asking you to notice that the ordinary, accepted, well-documented history contains, sitting in plain sight, the exact instrument Sister Perpetua described from inside a locked cell. A mechanism for taking the youngest members of a population, severing them from anyone who remembered, moving them beyond reach of anything that might remind them, and raising them inside a story that was chosen for them. Whatever that mechanism was truly for, it existed. She named it before she could have read about it, and it worked well enough that its subjects spent their whole lives believing the story, and only a few of them, in their 20s, ever felt the seam. That is what remains to be checked, and none of it requires the plates, or the notebook, or the West Ward, or even the nun. It requires only that you be willing to go and look at ordinary things with the tidy explanation held a little more loosely than you are used to holding it, which is, when you think about it, the single instruction she spent her confinement writing on every surface she could reach. She did not ask to be believed, she asked to be checked. Count the doors, not the years. The doors remember. She built her whole testimony out of the one kind of evidence that could survive 100 years of determined forgetting, the kind you have to walk up to and measure for yourself. And she left it, patiently, for exactly the moment we are living in now, when enough people have started to walk up and measure. There is one claim, and only one, that she left us no way to check, and she knew it, and she said so, and its uncheckability is itself the most disturbing thing she wrote, the stolen year, the altered calendar. The number that is wrong by more than we can imagine, kept wrong by a man in a locked room in a city we trust. Every other claim in the chronicle leaves a ruin behind, a buried window, a sunken door, a groove in a frame, a thin record in an open archive, something a person can walk up to and press a hand against. But you cannot walk up to a year. Time leaves no rubble. If the count itself was altered, there is no standing door to check it against, because the standard that would have checked it, the measure she cared about above all else, was the first thing stripped out and carted away. So the one alteration that would matter most is the one alteration that, by its own nature, can leave no trace except a feeling. And that, perhaps, is the real reason a woman who refused to write numbers spent her life pointing at doors. The doors were all she had left to point with. They were the last honest thing in a world that had quietly changed its own inch and its own hour, and she was trying, from inside a cell, to hand them to us before the last of them burned. So what do we actually have when the fear settles and the sensible morning comes? I think there are 3 honest ways to hold this, and I am not going to choose for you, because choosing for you would be its own small act of the thing this whole story warns against. The first reading is the plainest. Sister Perpetua was a gifted, troubled, deeply devout woman who, after 11 years of sitting with the mentally ill, absorbed their delusions and then, breaking down herself, produced a single grand and coherent madness that happened. by the strange logic such conditions sometimes follow, to organize itself around the real architectural oddities of the county she lived in. The other women copied her because suggestion in a closed ward is a real and documented force, and the mute wrote because even the mute can be taught by fear. The photographs are real, but show only what a shared delusion looks like on plaster. The trains and the forts and the buried doors are real too, but they are ordinary things onto which a sick and pattern-hungry mind projected a story. This reading asks you to believe that a woman with no education originated, in 1888, the precise framework that unschooled people would independently rebuild from the stones a century later. It is the sane reading, and it has one very large thing it cannot comfortably explain, which is the accuracy. The second reading is the one the asylum acted on, though it never said so out loud. It is that she was not deluded but dangerous, and that the danger was not to herself but to a settled story that a great many arrangements depend upon. In this reading, it does not finally matter whether the chronicle is literally true. What matters is that it is destabilizing, that it teaches people to distrust the tidy explanation and to go and check the doors, and that an institution built to classify such teaching as disease will always, when it meets the teaching, reach for the disease. This reading does not require a drowned world or a stolen year. It only requires that we notice how efficiently an inconvenient testimony was reduced to a single dismissive line, how a careful physician was eased out for writing too much down, and how the one wing of evidence a person could still touch happened to burn. Whatever she was treated exactly as you would treat someone who was right about something you could not afford to be true. The third reading is the one that keeps me up, and I offer it last and most quietly, framed as nothing more than a working hypothesis. It is that she was remembering, that there was a taller, finer world, that it ended within living memory in a flood of standing mud, that the ending was managed and renovated, and the surviving children were sorted and moved and raised inside a chosen story, that the free towers were stripped and the measures altered, and a stretch of the calendar quietly folded away, and that a small number of the transported children carried the buried truth into adulthood, where it surfaced as what their century called madness, and ours is only beginning to call memory. In this reading, Sister Perpetua was not the sickest woman on the West Ward. She was the most awake, and she spent her confinement doing the only thing an awake person could do inside a machine built for forgetting. She wrote the truth on every surface she could reach, in a form durable enough to survive a century, aimed at a generation that would one day stand among the buried doors and feel the seam for themselves. I cannot prove the third reading. I would not try. But I notice that it is the only one of the three that explains all of the evidence instead of most of it, and I notice that this is exactly the property she said to look for. The explanation that grows more confident as it explains less is the lie. The explanation that quietly ties every loose puzzle into one is the memory. And I notice, finally, that she predicted my discomfort. She predicted yours. She wrote, in effect, that whoever finally read her walls would end up standing right here, unable to prove and unable to dismiss, with a hand against the plaster, listening. So let me leave you where she wanted to leave you, which is not with an answer, but with an instruction, and with the buried doors that are still out there, still sunk in the ground, still waiting to be counted by anyone with the nerve to look. So here is what you carry out of this. A nun who was famous for quieting the disturbed, committed in 1888 to the one ward where her lucidity would count as illness. A chronicle written on every wall she could reach, and then, impossibly, on walls she could not, of a taller world, ended by a standing flood, and cleaned up by a new order that sorted the surviving children onto trains and changed the very measures of length and time. A physician who chose to preserve the question instead of answering it, and a set of hidden plates that waited a century for the exact moment we are now living in, when ordinary people started noticing the same buried doors from the outside and asking her forbidden question without ever knowing her name. If this story got its hooks into you, then go and do the one thing she asked. Go look at an old building near you, an old church or hall or station, and find where it sits too low in the ground, and stand there for a minute with the tidy explanation held loose in your hand. Then come back here, because there are more of these accounts, more buried doors and stripped towers and stolen years, and the next one I have waiting builds directly on this one. Subscribe so it finds you when it drops, and keep counting the doors. They are still out there. And if she was right, they still remember.